we're going to pick up where we left off with the last video, which is discussing property rights and their role in bargaining among individuals to arrive at socially optimal outcomes without government enforcement through interventions in markets. And so to have this conversation, we're going to start off by discussing what property rights are and then move on to discussing the Coase theorem. So property rights are just bundles of entitlements that govern how producers and consumers use resources. Without these, markets will have problems. So the efficient property right structure is going to require that property rights are exclusive, meaning that all benefits and costs should accrue only to the owner of that property. They are transferable, and so they can be bought and sold, they could be traded, and they're enforceable, meaning that those property rights should secure property from seizure or encroachment from others. And if you'll notice, this looks a little bit like the definition of a private good. And we're going to think of Coasean bargaining as being more beneficial there for the case where we can define goods as being excludable and rivalrous. So we're going to come up with a couple different taxonomies for property rights and a couple different ways of categorizing them. The first is going to be physical versus intellectual property. And so when we think of physical property, think of something that you can buy, something that's tangible, like cars, homes, food. Intellectual property, on the other hand, could be something like a product like music or Napster, or a patent for doorknobs. I know there are patents every year for just minor developments of smartphones, like the rounded edge of a smartphone. That was a patent. And protection of intellectual property rights is going to differ from physical property rights in that they protect the use of the idea, but not the idea itself. So obviously here I can get the idea for a rounded edge of a smartphone, and the patent doesn't protect me from having that idea. The patent protects the creator of that idea from others being able to use the idea to have value. So we can also think of different types of property regimes. And so private property is going to look more like those private goods where they're individually owned, access is granted solely to owners. State property may look more like a common good where it's owned and managed by the government. And so, or I guess more like a public good, so that it's non-rivalrous, non-excludable. Common property regimes are more like those club goods where we can keep people out that are excludable, but they're non-rivalrous. And open access is going to look much more like those common goods that we discussed with the tragedy of the commons. And so they're going to be rivalrous, non-excludable. So you don't want to think of these as one-to-one relationships, but typically these types of property regimes are going to map on to those types of private goods versus public goods. Okay, so with that basic understanding of property rights, we can discuss the Coase theorem. So the Coase theorem is named after Ronald Coase. So once again, another Nobel Prize winning economist whose degree wasn't actually in economics. I'm starting to notice a theme here. And so the Coase theorem is one of the most misunderstood concepts in environmental economics, maybe even in all of economics. And that is because it's based on certain assumptions And if you take those assumptions for granted, if you think that they're likely to be met, it's going to lead you to one interpretation. But Coase himself said these assumptions are unlikely to be met, and so we should be thinking about the negative of what the theorem actually states. And I'll make that more clear going forward. But the Coase theorem states that in the absence of transaction costs, if property rights are well defined and tradable, voluntary negotiations will lead to efficiency. And the whole point of this is that it doesn't matter who has initial property rights. And we kind of talked about this. We did a couple weeks ago, last week, talking about solutions to managing pollution, solutions to a coffee shop owner just dumping their trash in the street and annoying their neighbors. Whether we award the right to a clean street to the neighbors or we award the right to pollute to the coffee shop, as long as there are no transaction costs and those property rights are well defined and tradable, then whoever, it doesn't matter who has the property rights, as long as they can negotiate and trade and pay each other to pollute or pay to not pollute, then we're going to have the socially desirable level of pollution in that society, the socially desirable outcome. And so let's think more about what these assumptions are and how likely they are to be met. So first of all, property rights have to be well defined. We need to be clear about who has the rights so we know the starting points for negotiations, and specifically what those rights entail, what is the extent of those rights, who owns them. They need to be tradable. We need to be allowed to sell, transfer, reallocate if we choose, and there can't be transaction costs. So it can't be difficult or costly for us to buy or sell the right. And there should be a small number of parties, which is kind of part of the no transaction costs. I guess it's really a function of all of these, that as the number of parties goes up, the transaction costs increase, the rights become less well defined and become less tradable. So are property rights well defined? Well, it kind of depends on where you live in the world. And so there's a map here of the status of land tenure and property rights, thinking about where they're most threatened, where they're least threatened. And obviously this has some bias in that it's not ranking some of the most developed parts of the world. But here we can see the darker colors represent countries where property rights are maybe least well respected. And one of those countries is South Africa. And we know from recent history there that due to a long history of all kinds of oppression and kind of losing track of who had original property rights to what land, there's been more violent takeovers of property by people who feel as if it was stolen from their ancestors in the first place. And I guess the point here is that when the right to own property becomes less well known, then it's harder to engage in trade of that property. And even though the US isn't ranked in this example, it's still kind of the case in the US. It's just that we have insurance for it. So if any of you in the future decide to buy a home, you're going to need to buy title insurance. And so title insurance ensures that the people who are selling you your home actually own the home, actually had the right to sell it in the first place, and that somebody can't look through the history of records and go back to the 1900s and find one person, or sorry, not 1900s, like the 1920s, and find one person who sold that land 100 years ago who didn't actually have the right to sell it, and invalidate every transaction after that point. And so because that would hold up in law and then possibly invalidate your right to own that land, You can buy title insurance, which would protect you from being from losing everything that you've paid for that land so far, or that home so far. It's really pretty wild, but that's just going to show how even in one of the most developed capitalist economies in the world, these property rights may not be as well defined as we think they are. So property rights also have to be tradable, and this is a graph you have no responsibility to learn at all, but this is an Edgeworth box, which shows how trade between two parties can lead to a Pareto optimal outcome. And as long as the allocation for the individuals is somewhere along that line, we're going to have a distribution which works, for which we cannot change the allocation without making anybody else worse off. We can't make anybody better off without making somebody worse off. So I guess you don't really have to know this, but I just wanted to reinforce that there's an economically theoretical way to think about the tradability and the desirability of property rights here. So while there are certainly limitations to the assumptions of how well defined property rights are and how tradable they are, the biggest assumption, or the one that is maybe least likely to hold, is that there can't be transaction costs. There are transaction costs for everything. And this is one of the, I think, most overlooked assumptions in all of economics, but specifically with regard to the Coase theorem. And Coase was well aware of this. But if you think about how much it costs for negotiations, that once again, if you go to buy and sell property, not only do you have to pay, if you're selling the property, not only do you have to pay 6% of the cost of the sale of your property to real estate agents, but you have to pay for a moving company, or you have to invest your own time into moving from one house to another. You have to pay for a title. You have to pay for that title insurance. And with any sort of, pretty much any sort of trade, there's going to be some sort of transaction costs. And so related to that, when the number of parties increases, both the possibility of transaction costs increase, as well as the definition of the property rights becomes a little murkier, and the tradability may decrease as well. And we could have upstream parties or downstream parties, and if there's just one of those two, then maybe the Coase theorem is more likely to hold. But Coase himself really wanted to highlight the fact that these assumptions are not likely to be met, especially the one of no transaction costs. And so this has led to basically two different interpretations of the Coase theorem. The free market version is just saying as long as both parties are free to bargain, the final amount of pollution will be independent of the initial allocation of property rights. So we shouldn't care who has the right to pollute or the right to avoid pollution, because these assumptions are likely to be met. And so later in Coase's life, he wanted to be very clear that this is unlikely to hold, and that's not what he intended for the theorem to be interpreted as. The fair market version is highlighting the plausibility of the existence of transaction costs and other violations of these assumptions, and indicates that the final amount of pollution ends up depending on who has that initial right to either pollute or be free from the pollution of others. And so given the existence of transaction costs, we do need to pay attention to the initial assignment of property rights. And so we should also be clear that even with the free market interpretation of the Coase theorem, that if all of those assumptions are met, if there are no transaction costs and we have property rights that are well defined and tradable, just because we have the socially efficient solution or distribution of pollution does not mean that we have an equitable distribution. And if those property rights are initially defined or allocated to the polluter and they have a right to pollute, then we still may have a moral grievance with thinking that somebody has to pay to not be polluted upon, while the polluter is free to just impose externalities on those around them. So efficiency doesn't mean equity. Transaction costs are often not negligible. And in general, we can think of this as being more of a laissez-faire solution for pollution, but that, once again, doesn't mean that it's equitable, and it's also not necessarily likely to hold if transaction costs exist. So we'll consider a series of examples here, and hopefully these will be helpful as you think about solving some of your homework problems and thinking about studying for the exam. So in this first simple example, let's just think that you, student of Econ 235 watching this video, have a car that's worth $3,000 to you. If it were available at a used car dealer, you'd be willing to pay $3,000 for it, but it's worth $4,000 to me. There's something about it. I had an uncle who had that type of car, and I'm willing to pay $4,000 for that particular car, which you currently own. So it's obviously then going to be efficient for me to own it, but we don't need for the law or the government to come in and say the efficient solution is for Will to own that car. You have to sell it to him. You have to give it to him. What we need are going to be definition of property rights, there to be low transaction costs, and for the right to that car to be tradable. And so if I start out owning the car, there's no reason for you to buy it from me. I value it more than you do. I end up with it, and that's the efficient solution. If you start out with owning the car, there's a clear incentive for me to buy it, and if I can buy it, I'll end up with it, and that's efficient. The real question is, at what price do I buy it? And the main insight here of the Coase theorem in a kind of textbook chalkboard framework where these assumptions are likely to be met is that regardless of who owns the car at first, we're going to get the efficient outcome of where the car should belong or who it should belong to. So the most famous example, chalkboard example of the Coase theorem is that of a railway, which is going to run a coal-burning steam locomotive through a farming area and has caused fires in the crop fields in the past. That maybe it makes sparks on the track, or something goes off the train, lights the field on fire, and causes damages to the crops. There's a clear externality from running the railway. And so to think about how we can decide or how we can visualize or understand what the cost, how we could calculate or quantify the price at which these property rights should be exchanged, we're going to use a table which is going to list the cost of running these trains. And it's going to differ by the number of trains which we run. And so here we have the number of trains, the private cost to the train, to the railway owners, the value of the damages to the crops, and then the social cost, which is just going to be the sum of the private cost and the cost of the externality. So to illustrate the Coase theorem using this example, let's suppose that the revenue from a train run is going to be $350, and we're just going to assume that that is constant, whether we run one train, two trains, etc. So question then is, how many runs are optimal by only considering the costs to the railway, the cost to the train runners, I'm not sure what the word would be there, and how many runs would be socially optimal for both the railway and for the farmers. And once we know that the difference between those two, we can think about how much does the farmer receive or pay in each of the cases for initially owning or needing to buy the property rights to prevent the damage of their crops. So if the railway is not considering the damage that they impose to the farmers, then all we're doing is considering the allocation of train runs such that the marginal private cost is equal to the marginal benefit for that company. And so remember, we said that the revenue from running a train is $350 per run, and we said that's constant. So the marginal benefit, the marginal revenue for each train run is going to be $350. We previously illustrated the private cost, and we could then calculate what the marginal private cost would be. Remember, marginal just means a little bit more, a little bit less. And so the difference from 0 trains to 1 train is 100. So the marginal private cost is 100. The difference from $100 from the first train to $200 for running 2 trains is again 100, but the total cost for running 3 trains is 400. And so since that's 200 more than the second train, then the marginal private cost would be 200. And just thinking back to those supply and demand graphs where the socially desirable or the efficient distribution, the efficient allocation of goods and services occurs where the supply and demand curves cross, which is where the marginal cost curve and the marginal benefit curve cross. And so we want to set or want to consider our efficient number or efficient quantity, in this case, the efficient number of trains to run, as where the marginal cost equals the marginal benefit. And for only thinking of the private optimal solution, this is going to be excluding that externality of crop damage. Now, when we no longer think of the marginal cost as being a marginal private cost, but a marginal social cost, then we can calculate what the marginal social cost is by seeing what's the difference in the sum of the private costs and the crop damage for each number of train runs. We can calculate the difference between the social cost for 1 train run, 2 train runs, 2 train runs, 3 train runs, and that difference will represent the marginal social cost. So where we have the marginal social cost equal to the marginal benefit would be the socially optimal number of trains to run. And so clearly here you can see that when we don't take into account the externality of damage to the crop field, we're going to have an incentive to overproduce the externality at too low of a cost, or I guess in this case the cost isn't as relevant, but we're going to overproduce that externality. And when we take into account the externality of the crop damage, the socially optimal outcome is going to be having fewer trains run. So the question is then, how do we get to that socially desirable equilibrium when the property rights are initially assigned to the farmers versus when the property rights are initially assigned to the rail company? So if the right to not be polluted, in this case not to have the risk of fires due to trains running, is initially assigned to the farmers, then the rail company is going to have to pay the farmers for every car that they run. And they're going to have to pay them at least the marginal crop damage, which is constant here as at $200 for each train that they would run. So if they want to run 1 train, the farmers are going to be indifferent between not having that train run or receiving the $200, which could compensate them for their damages. If they want to run 2 trains, then the farmers are going to be indifferent between not having those trains run or receiving $400 for the damages, and so on. And so how many of those $200 increments will the rail company be willing to pay? Well, they'll be willing to pay them so long as their marginal net benefit from running the train and paying the farmers is going to be greater than 0. And so essentially we could create an additional column here on the right side of the table, which would subtract $200 from the marginal net benefit of the company. And so this marginal net benefit is taking into account their marginal benefit from running a train, and net just means subtracting out the marginal cost, or in this case, the marginal private cost. So if we add another column here, which takes into account not only the marginal net benefit of the train company for thinking of their revenue and their private cost, but also the cost of paying the farmers, then we could just subtract $200 from each of these values. If we did that from the first train, then the train company would still have a private profit of $50 for running that train once they pay for the crop damage or the property rights to exert damage upon the farmers. And the same would hold for that second train they run. We subtract 200, it's still positive 50. However, for the third train, if we subtract 200 from that, then the train company is taking a loss by running that third train. So they're going to decide to only run those first 2, which remember was the socially desirable equilibrium. It was our social optimum of running 2 trains where the marginal social cost equals the marginal social benefit. And so in this case, assigning the property rights to the farmers and then having the rail company pay to pollute or pay to exert their damage is going to give us a socially desirable outcome. But the Coase theorem suggests that it doesn't matter who the property rights are initially assigned to, so long as our assumptions are met, we're going to have the socially optimal outcome regardless. And so let's consider the case when the property rights to exert crop damage are initially assigned to the rail company. In this case, they're deciding to run 4 trains because that's the last point at which their marginal net benefits are positive. They would be taking a loss with running the 5th train. And so for them to be willing to not run that 4th train, they would have to receive a payment of at least $50. Seeing that the farmers would expect a loss of $200 from that 4th train, the farmers are going to be willing to pay every bit of $50 for not running that train. So they'll pay them at least $50. What about the 3rd train? Sure, the same thing goes where the rail company will take will expect a benefit, expect a profit of $150 from running the 3rd train. And so the farmers are going to have to pay them at least $150 not to run that 3rd train. And because the damage from the 3rd train is $200, then they'll pay them not to run the 3rd train as well. And so by now, the farmers have paid the rail company at least $200, at least the $50 not to run the 4th train, at least the $150 not to run the 3rd train. And the question then is whether the rail company would run the 2nd train. And as the rail company would expect a benefit of $250 from running the 2nd train, and the damage from running that 2nd train to the farmers is only $200, they're not going to pay them to not run that 2nd train. So once again, the socially desirable outcome of 2 trains being run is what we would expect regardless of who was initially assigned property rights. However, the total transaction cost for the property rights will depend on who was initially assigned those property rights. And so in this case, if the farmers were initially assigned the property rights, the rail owners would have to pay $400. And if the rail company was initially assigned the property rights, the farmers would have to pay $200. So this illustrates a key difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept, and the importance of framing of these types of decisions. And so we can think of the difference between the maximum amount that you would be willing to pay to avoid environmental degradation and the minimum amount that you are willing to accept to tolerate the environment being degraded. And so when we apply these terms, this difference to the example of the car, which I valued more than you did, then the price at which you could sell that car to me would be between my willingness to pay and your willingness to accept. And so at any point between those two values, we're going to have a valid or viable sale. And so the net difference between the willingness to pay of the buyer and the willingness to accept the seller is going to be the social surplus, which is created by the trading of those goods. So the question is then, which is larger? When we compare willingness to pay, willingness to accept, which one is going to give us a better idea of the maximum scope of the environmental damage or an environmental service, the value of an environmental service? So willingness to accept is usually larger than willingness to pay for several reasons. And so we see this in non-market valuation literature, specifically contingent valuation, when we ask survey questions with, depending on how we frame that question, whether we frame it as what are you willing to pay for this, or what would you have to accept to have your environment degraded, the willingness to accept questions end up getting a much larger value, or giving a much larger value, which is what we noted as well in our video on non-market valuation. So a lot of that has to do with the endowment effect, that people feel that they have a right to something and they would have to give up more of that it's more valuable because they already own it. Therefore, the amount of money that one would have to accept to give up something they have, such as environmental quality, or the right to clean air, clean water, the right not to be polluted, will be larger than what the person is willing to pay to buy the good. And so initial allocation of property rights really do matter when we have this difference between willingness to accept and willingness to pay. So this isn't to say that the Coase theorem isn't valuable, but that free market interpretation really does run into some limitations when we consider that the psychology of economic agents is not just being this purely rational, happiness maximizing kind of robot that 1950s, 1960s economists like to think of people as behaving like. And so just to highlight a couple other reasons why willingness to accept may be larger than willingness to pay. Willingness to pay is going to be constrained by one's budget constraint, that their income or wealth are going to define what they are able to pay for something, whereas your willingness to accept is unbounded. You could say that, and it could be true, that somebody would have to pay me $5 million to give up my dog. And whereas if I wanted to buy a new dog, or if someone took my dog and I had to pay a certain amount of money to give him back, I'm not willing to pay $5 million. I love the guy, but that is, it's just not possible. So the moral context there matters as well then. where people may consider it morally wrong to accept any amount of compensation to allow environmental degradation. And these are all valid reasons for why willingness to accept may differ from willingness to pay, and why the initial allocation of property rights does matter. So we're going to continue to do exercises in this class which use Coasean bargaining to show how free trade between parties may lead to an efficient solution. But I want you to know, with its application to the real world, when you're confronted with the argument that we should just let people negotiate and trade the right to pollute or the right to be to not have pollution, the argument that free markets will give the socially desirable outcome are going to be highly contingent upon the initial allocation of property rights if there are transaction costs which are likely to hold.